He cheated. Now I'm stuck with half his debt. From the moment I found out about the affair, I felt like the floor had dropped out from under me. It wasn't just the betrayal that shattered me. It was the realization that I had married a stranger, someone I thought I knew inside and out, only to discover a man capable of deception on multiple levels. The first time I confronted him, my voice trembled with a mix of fury and disbelief. How could you do this? After everything, after all we've built. He didn't look at me. He stared blankly at the floor, mumbling excuses that sounded hollow, rehearsed, meaningless. The house that had once been a sanctuary now felt like a trap, each corner echoing with memories of what I thought our life together was. And then came the second punch, one I hadn't anticipated. The realization that I was legally responsible for half of the debt he had racked up without my knowledge. Credit cards maxed out, a personal loan he had hidden, late fees piling on top of interest. Every number was a sharp jab to my chest, a reminder that I was now tied not just emotionally, but financially to a man who had violated my trust in my worst possible way. I spent nights lying awake, staring at the ceiling, calculating how we had gotten here. How had I missed the signs? How had I trusted so blindly? And more importantly, how was I going to survive the financial mess he left me in? The next morning, I opened the first of many letters from creditors, my hands shaking. Each envelope was a reminder of my new reality, the harsh truth that love and marriage didn't erase responsibility, even when betrayal had fractured the foundation of trust. I called a lawyer immediately, seeking advice on how to protect myself, how to navigate the minefield of joint debt, and whether there was any way I could shield myself from the consequences of his reckless behavior. Sitting in the office, across from a woman who seemed almost too calm for the storm raging inside me, I explained everything: the affair, the lies, the hidden debt. She listened, occasionally jotting notes, occasionally raising an eyebrow, and then finally said, "You have options, but this will be a long, painful process. Be prepared to fight for every penny and for your sanity." Her words hit harder than I expected. Long and painful were words I didn't want to hear. I wanted resolution. I wanted justice. I wanted my life back. But the reality was that reclaiming control wasn't going to be quick or easy. The following weeks were a blur of statements, phone calls, and meetings. I had to separate my personal feelings from the financial reality, but every number reminded me of his betrayal. Each charge was a symbol of deceit, each interest fee a whisper of what I had overlooked. Friends tried to console me, some with gentle advice, some with harsh truths I wasn't ready to hear. "You can't stay," one friend said. "This isn't just about money, it's about respect and integrity." Another whispered, "Fight for yourself, but remember you signed up for some of this legally. You can't ignore it." Their words didn't make me feel safer. They made me feel trapped, caught in a web I hadn't spun, but was now forced to navigate. One night, after a particularly brutal day dealing with creditors and lawyers, I found him sitting on the couch, sipping a beer as if nothing had changed. I couldn't contain the fury that had been simmering for weeks. "Do you have any idea what you've done?" I shouted, my voice cracking with anger and hurt. He looked at me, expression blank, and muttered something about mistakes and regret. But words were meaningless now. Actions, or lack thereof, were all that mattered. That night, I sat on the kitchen floor. Papers spread out in front of me like a battlefield map, calculating how to survive financially, emotionally, and mentally. I realized that while I couldn't erase the debt, I could strategize, fight, and reclaim some semblance of control. I made a plan. First, I would separate all accounts, ensuring that no further spending could tie me to his mistakes. Next, I would negotiate payment plans with creditors to make the amounts manageable. Finally, I would prepare mentally for the legal battle ahead, knowing that divorce was inevitable and that splitting the debt fairly would be a critical part of the process. The legal battles were even more draining than the financial ones. Every Court appearance was a reminder of betrayal. Every negotiation, a negotiation not just for money but for dignity. He tried to downplay his responsibility, arguing that some debts weren't shared obligations, that I shouldn't bear the consequences of his decisions. I wanted to scream, to throw the papers across the courtroom, to demand that someone see the full magnitude of the damage he had done. Instead, I remained calm, forcing myself to focus on facts, numbers, and documentation. It was exhausting, but I knew that emotional outbursts would only harm my case. Friends and family rallied around, me in small ways, some offering financial advice, some simply listening, but even their support was limited. At the end of the day, I had to fight this battle alone, relying on my own strength, intelligence, and resilience. Nights blurred into days as I juggled work, court appearances, and endless paperwork. I couldn't sleep, couldn't eat properly, couldn't escape the constant calculation of what was owed, what I could pay, and what would happen if I didn't. The betrayal lingered, a constant companion that made even small victories feel hollow. And yet, through the chaos, I discovered a strength I hadn't known I possessed. I became meticulous, strategic, and unflinching. I learned to read contracts like a hawk, to anticipate arguments before they were made, and to protect myself in ways I had never imagined needing to. Slowly, I began to see that while he had caused the mess, I had the power to navigate it, to survive it, and eventually, to thrive beyond it. One evening, after a particularly grueling day of negotiations, I sat alone in my apartment surrounded by papers and spreadsheets. I reflected on how the man I had married, a man I trusted, loved, and built a life with, could be so reckless, so deceitful, so emotionally callous. And yet I also realized that my life was not over. The debt was enormous, the betrayal profound, but neither could define me. I could fight, I could strategize, and I could reclaim my future. That night, I drafted a detailed plan for managing the debt, setting up automatic payments, and ensuring that every dollar I could control was being used wisely. It wasn't glamorous. It wasn't satisfying in the emotional sense, but it was necessary. Each step was a reclaiming of power, a small victory against the chaos he had left behind. Weeks turned into months, and the legal proceedings progressed slowly but steadily. Every hearing, every negotiation, every document submitted was a reminder of how far I had come. I had transformed from someone blindsided and devastated into someone capable, strategic, and unyielding. The emotional scars remained, but the panic and helplessness had been replaced with determination. I began to understand that surviving, this wasn't about revenge. It was about survival, dignity, and creating a foundation for a life that wasn't dictated by his choices. And through it all, I reflected constantly on what this experience had taught me. That trust is fragile, that betrayal can come in many forms, and that even when someone you love turns out to be unworthy of that love, you still have the power to protect yourself and reclaim your life. The debt was a prison, but one I was learning to navigate, brick by brick, with clarity, precision, and unwavering resolve. And though the path ahead remained uncertain, I knew that I was no longer the same person who had walked into marriage, blind to the truth. I had changed, I had adapted, and I had grown stronger in ways I hadn't imagined. Am I wrong for feeling the weight of betrayal, yet choosing to fight tooth and nail to reclaim a life destroyed by someone I once loved? The weeks that followed the initial shock of discovery were a relentless blur of calls, letters, and court documents. Every morning I woke up with a pit in my stomach, knowing that somewhere, someone was assessing how much of his reckless choices I would be forced to bear. It wasn't just the numbers, it was the principle, the injustice of being punished for someone else's deceit. I found myself obsessively checking account balances. That night, I went through every bill, every statement, meticulously verifying what was his responsibility, what fell legally on my shoulders, and what I could contest. Hours passed without pause. The house was silent except for the hum of the refrigerator and the occasional siren from outside. By the time I looked up, my eyes were burning, my back ached, and my mind was numb. I realized that surviving this ordeal would require more than just emotional endurance. It would require strategy, precision, and an almost obsessive attention to detail. The next day, I met with my lawyer again, armed with spreadsheets, statements, and notes detailing every questionable transaction. She listened, occasionally nodding, occasionally frowning. "This will be a fight," she said. "But you've done the work. You have the evidence. Now we make them acknowledge it." The word fight echoed in my head. Fight. That was exactly what this had become. A battle not just for financial survival, but for dignity, sanity, and the right to reclaim the life that had been hijacked by someone I trusted implicitly. Court days were torture. Sitting in the sterile, echoing halls, listening to the back and forth, between lawyers, I felt a storm of emotions: rage, sadness, disbelief, fear. I caught glimpses of him sitting across the room, his face impassive, occasionally glancing my way with what I can only describe as a mix of guilt and defiance. It infuriated me that he could sit there, so detached, while I navigated the wreckage of our shared life. One particular hearing sticks in my mind. He tried to argue that a chunk of the debt wasn't joint, that I should bear none of it. I could feel my hands shake, my heart hammering in my chest. My lawyer calmly presented evidence, receipts, account, statements, and a detailed breakdown of his spending, showing just how intertwined our finances had been. I sat there, watching the judge review documents, silently counting the seconds, praying that justice would align with truth. When the ruling finally came, I felt a surge of vindication. The judge acknowledged my claims and enforced a fair split of responsibility. It wasn't perfect, and I still carried a portion of the debt, but it was far less than what he had initially tried to push onto me. Walking out of that courtroom, I felt a weight lift, but I also knew the fight wasn't over. Managing my portion of the debt became a full-time commitment. I restructured my life around payments, budgeting every dollar, tracking every expense, and learning to live with far less than I had grown accustomed to. Nights were long and lonely. There were moments of despair when I wanted to give up, to let the creditors take their pound of flesh, to collapse into bed and cry until exhaustion took over. But I couldn't. I had responsibilities, not just to myself, but to my future. I started taking on extra work, freelance projects, and side gigs to increase my income. I cut unnecessary expenses, renegotiated bills, and began creating a financial cushion to prevent myself from being blindsided again. Each payment I made felt like reclaiming a small piece of control, a tiny victory against the chaos he had left behind. At the same time, I grappled with the emotional fallout. Anger was a constant companion. How could someone I loved and trusted betray me so completely? How could he destroy not only our marriage, but also my financial security with such reckless disregard? Therapy became a lifeline. Sitting across from a counselor, I poured out months of suppressed fear, rage, and sorrow. I learned to separate the man I loved from the man I now knew, the one capable of deceit, irresponsibility, and selfishness. Those sessions were grueling, forcing me to confront my own choices, the red flags I had ignored, and the patterns I had allowed to continue. But they were necessary. I realized that without processing the emotional betrayal, I could never move forward, no matter how meticulously I managed the debt. Friends offered advice, sometimes helpful, sometimes painfully blunt. One friend told me, "You can't change him, but you can control how you react. Protect yourself, always." Another said, "You deserve someone who wouldn't do this." Never forget that. Their words cut both ways, reminders of my worth, but also of the life I thought I had and the illusions I had held. As weeks turned into months, I developed a system, almost ritualistic, for managing the financial chaos. I woke up early, reviewed every account, ensured automatic payments were set, and tracked any deviations immediately. It became obsessive, but obsession was preferable to the panic of being blindsided. Slowly, a sense of control returned, paired with a cautious optimism. One night, sitting at my kitchen table surrounded by bills and spreadsheets, I realized something profound. I had survived the initial shock, the betrayal, and the financial threat. And though the debt was still present, I was no longer powerless. I had become vigilant, strategic, and resilient. That realization was both empowering and terrifying, because it meant acknowledging how close I had come to losing everything, and how much work it would take to rebuild fully. In those long, quiet hours, I also reflected on what had brought us here. I had trusted blindly, ignored red flags, and assumed that love alone could sustain a partnership. He had hidden debts, led a double life, and betrayed my trust in the deepest possible way. And in the aftermath, I was forced to confront not only his mistakes, but also the vulnerabilities that had allowed me to be so thoroughly blindsided. Slowly, I began to reclaim my identity, separate from the marriage, separate from the debt, separate from the man who had caused such devastation. I started journaling, documenting the financial strategies I used, the lessons I learned, and the emotional battles I fought. Writing became therapy, a tool to process the chaos and to plan for the future. Each entry reminded me that I had agency, that I could survive and thrive despite the odds. Yet, even as I gained control, resentment simmered beneath the surface. I would catch myself thinking about his betrayal, his recklessness, and the sheer audacity of expecting me to carry the burden of his mistakes. Nights were hardest, lying in bed, staring at the ceiling, replaying moments of deceit, imagining conversations that never happened, fantasizing about confrontations that could never undo the damage. And still, through the exhaustion, the rage, and the fear, I persisted. I persisted because survival demanded it, because my dignity demanded it, and because my future demanded it. Slowly, things began to stabilize. Payments were manageable, income streams steadied, and emotional volatility began to subside. I started to envision a life beyond this turmoil, a life where financial freedom, emotional security, and self-respect could coexist. And in those moments of clarity, I realized that the journey wasn't just about money. It was about reclaiming power, setting boundaries, and refusing to allow someone else's deceit to define my life. Each small victory, a cleared statement, a successful negotiation, a day without panic, felt monumental. I could feel myself growing stronger, more capable, and increasingly determined to ensure that the past would not dictate my future. And yet, despite all the progress, I had to remind myself that trust, once broken, cannot be fully restored. The betrayal lingered like a shadow, a quiet reminder that not everyone deserves your faith, your loyalty, or your financial security. I had learned the hard way that love is not always protective, that marriage is not always safe, and that sometimes the person you thought you knew best is capable of unimaginable deceit. And as I prepared for the next phase, the divorce, the final settlement, and the ultimate disentanglement, I felt a mixture of the divorce proceedings loomed over me like a storm I couldn't escape. Every document I signed, every meeting I attended, reminded me that this wasn't just about ending a marriage. It was a battle for survival, for dignity, and for a future that wasn't overshadowed by his mistakes. The financial stakes alone were staggering, but the emotional toll was just as severe. Sitting in the courtroom, listening to his lawyer argue for minimal responsibility on his part, I felt my blood pressure spike. It was infuriating that he could sit there, unrepentant, as if the betrayal and debt weren't real, as if the years of trust I had invested were meaningless. I clenched my fists, forcing myself to remain composed, knowing that any emotional outburst could be twisted against me. My lawyer, ever the calm presence, whispered that I was doing everything right, that my meticulous documentation and preparation were exactly what we needed. But calmness felt hollow when I walked out of the courthouse into the chill of the morning air, my stomach in knots, heart heavy with both exhaustion and lingering anger. Outside, I met friends for lunch, though conversation was awkward. They wanted to comfort me, but I could see the discomfort in their eyes. Divorce, betrayal, and shared debt were not easy topics to discuss over pasta and coffee. Still, their presence was grounding, a reminder that I was not entirely alone, even if the path ahead felt lonely and treacherous. Back at the apartment, I spread out the financial documents across the kitchen table, the glow of the overhead light highlighting stacks of statements, letters, and contracts. I spent hours calculating, recalculating, ensuring that every number was accurate, every debt accounted for. The obsession was exhausting, but necessary. Each calculation, each verification, was a small act of reclaiming control from the chaos he had left behind. Sleep became a luxury I rarely allowed myself. Nights were long, punctuated by the hum of the refrigerator and the distant sounds of the city. I would lie awake, thinking of the months I had spent rebuilding my life, questioning every decision, every assumption, and every ounce of trust I had once given. Anger was constant, simmering just beneath the surface, threatening to erupt at the slightest provocation. And yet, amidst the exhaustion and emotional turmoil, a small seed of determination had taken root. I realized that surviving this ordeal was not enough. I had to thrive despite it. I began to explore opportunities for extra income, side projects that could bolster my finances and ensure that I was never again tied so vulnerably to someone else's recklessness. Freelancing, consulting, even small investments became part of my strategy. Each success, no matter how small, was a victory against the chaos he had wrought. Social interactions became strained. Friends and family were supportive, but I could feel the distance growing. People were sympathetic, but sympathy could only go so far. I needed results, proof that I could survive and reclaim my life. I immersed myself in work, in strategy, in the meticulous reconstruction of my finances. But the emotional wounds were slower to heal. Trust was fractured not just with him, but with myself. I questioned every judgment, every assumption, every relationship I had built. Could I trust another person fully? Could I even trust my own instincts? The questions haunted me as I navigated the daily grind of debt management and divorce proceedings. Court sessions became increasingly tense. His lawyers were aggressive, challenging every claim, attempting to minimize his obligations while amplifying mine. I had to remain vigilant, countering every point with documentation, proof, and unwavering resolve. The tension was exhausting, both mentally and physically. I often left the courthouse with my head pounding, stomach churning, and a sense of dread that the next hearing could undo weeks of progress. And yet, there were small victories. A successfully contested claim, a favorable ruling, a creditor willing to negotiate. Each one reinforced the sense that I was not powerless, that I could shape the outcome despite the betrayal and chaos. One evening, after a particularly grueling day, I sat alone in the apartment, surrounded by spreadsheets and statements, reflecting on how far I had come. The man I had once loved, trusted, and envisioned a future with had turned out to be someone entirely different, someone whose choices had nearly destroyed me, and yet I realized that the experience had forged a resilience I hadn't known I possessed. I was stronger, more strategic, and more vigilant than I had ever been. The nights were hardest. Memories of intimacy, trust, and shared dreams clashed violently with the reality of betrayal, debt, and deceit. Sleep was elusive, replaced by racing thoughts, planning sessions, and the occasional flood of tears I could no longer suppress. I longed for normalcy, for a life where financial security and emotional peace were not constant battles. Slowly, I began to reclaim some semblance of routine. Morning rituals, budgeting sessions, and strategic planning became my anchor. I created a system to track every payment, every bill, every dollar owed, and every dollar I controlled. The structure provided a sense of control, a necessary counterbalance to the chaos of betrayal and shared debt. I also began to reflect deeply on the nature of trust and betrayal. How had I been so blind? How had I trusted someone capable of such deception? The introspection was painful, but necessary. I had to understand not only his motives, but also my own vulnerabilities, the blind spots that had allowed me to be so thoroughly deceived. Therapy sessions became more intense. Each session peeled back layers of anger, grief, and self-doubt, revealing both strengths and weaknesses I had never confronted. I learned to acknowledge my feelings without judgment, to process anger without letting it consume me, and to set boundaries that would protect me in the future. There were moments of profound isolation. Friends would check in, but the depth of my struggle was difficult to convey. Conversations often ended with awkward silences or rushed reassurances. I realized that while support was valuable, the journey was ultimately mine to navigate. Financial management, legal strategy, and emotional healing were intertwined, and neglecting one would jeopardize the others. The fight for financial justice became symbolic, a stand against the emotional betrayal I had suffered. Every negotiation, every settlement, every payment plan was not just about money. It was about reclaiming agency, dignity, and control over a life nearly destroyed by someone I had trusted implicitly. One particularly tense negotiation with creditors stands out in my memory. I had meticulously prepared, armed with spreadsheets and documented evidence of his spending and deception. The creditor, a stern woman with a sharp gaze, initially resisted my requests, insisting that I was partially responsible for the debt. My hands shook as I presented evidence, my voice steady despite the fury simmering beneath. Hours later, after what felt like an eternity, she relented, agreeing to a more manageable repayment plan. I remember stepping outside, breathing in the crisp air, and feeling a surge of both relief and empowerment. It was a small victory, but in the midst of chaos, small victories were monumental. As the months progressed, I noticed subtle changes in myself. I became more disciplined, more strategic, more vigilant. I couldn't erase the betrayal or the debt, but I could control my response, my actions, and my future. I learned to find strength in routine, clarity in documentation, and resilience in the face of constant adversity. And yet, even as I grew stronger, moments of doubt lingered. Nights were hardest, memories of the marriage intermingling with the betrayal, replaying endlessly in my mind. I questioned my judgment, my ability to trust, and even my right to reclaim a life free from chaos. But slowly, gradually, I realized that I was not defined by his choices or the debts he had accumulated. I was defined by my response, my resilience, and my determination to survive and thrive despite unimaginable challenges. By the time the first major court settlement was finalized, I felt a cautious sense of victory. A portion of the debt had been legally assigned to him, reducing my financial burden significantly. The relief was tangible, yet tempered by the reality that the divorce was far from over, that emotional healing would take longer than legal closure, and that trust, once broken, would never fully return. And still, through the exhaustion, anger, and heartbreak, I pressed forward. Each step, each payment, each legal maneuver was a reclamation of my life, a refusal to be defined by someone else's deceit. I had survived the initial shock, the betrayal, and the chaos, and I was now actively building a future where I could be independent, financially secure, and emotionally resilient. Am I wrong for fighting so fiercely to reclaim a life nearly destroyed by deceit while still grappling with the emotional scars left behind? By the time the final divorce hearing arrived, I had become unrecognizable to the person I had been at the start of this ordeal. The naive, trusting, optimistic partner who had walked into marriage blind to red flags had been replaced by someone vigilant, strategic, and painfully aware of human duplicity. Yet beneath the armor of resilience, the emotional scars remained raw. Sitting in the courtroom, watching him across the room, I felt a mix of anger, sorrow, and incredulity. How had someone I loved so completely become the architect of my suffering? How could the man I thought I knew so intimately hide entire chapters of his life, entire sums of money, entire betrayals, and expect me to bear the fallout? The judge entered, and the room fell silent, the weight of anticipation pressing on every shoulder. My lawyer whispered, "Stay focused. We have all the evidence. You've done everything right." I nodded, though my stomach churned with anxiety. The final arguments were tense. His lawyer attempted one last effort to minimize his responsibility, painting me as somehow complicit or naive. I felt my pulse quicken, the familiar sting of fury threatening to rise. But I remained calm, presenting the documentation, the financial records, the meticulously detailed spreadsheets that demonstrated the reckless accumulation of debt and the betrayal woven through each transaction. As the judge reviewed the documents, I realized something profound. I was no longer just fighting for money. I was fighting for my dignity, for the right to reclaim a life that had been hijacked, and for the closure that had been denied to me for months. When the ruling was finally delivered, I felt a mixture of relief and vindication. The judge acknowledged my claims, ruled in my favor on several key points, and ensured that a fair portion of the debt was assigned to him. I exhaled, a long, shaky breath that carried with it months of fear, anxiety, and sleepless nights. It wasn't perfect. Some debt still remained my responsibility. But it was enough to reclaim a sense of control, enough to begin rebuilding my life on my terms. Walking out of the courthouse, the sun hitting my face, I felt both exhausted and empowered. I had survived a storm that had threatened to destroy me, and I had emerged stronger, wiser, and more resilient than I had ever imagined possible. The months following the final ruling were dedicated to rebuilding. I created a financial plan, one that not only addressed the remaining debt, but also ensured that I would never again be vulnerable to someone else's recklessness. Savings accounts, investments, budgeting, and side income streams became my armor. Each dollar managed, each strategic decision made, felt like reclaiming power from the chaos he had created. Emotionally, the journey was far more complex. I grappled with the betrayal, the heartbreak, and the lingering anger. Trust had been fractured, not just in him, but in myself. Could I ever fully trust another person? Could I allow myself to open my heart without fear of deceit?